Hi, I'm Lindsay Hall, Head of ESG Thought Leadership at S&P Global.
And I'm Esther Wielden, a Senior Writer on the ESG Thought Leadership team.
Welcome to ESG Insider, a podcast hosted by S&P Global, where we explore environmental, social, and governance issues that are shaping investor activity and company strategy. Esther, we have many acronyms in the sustainability world. Recently, we've been talking a lot about a new one, SFDR, or the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. This is a new set of rules on sustainable investing that came into force in the EU in March 2021. And as we discussed in a recent episode of this podcast, SFDR is expected to drastically change the scope of sustainable investing by providing greater transparency and increasing disclosure. And this is a particularly big deal for the private equity world, which has historically relied on self-regulation.
Today, we're diving into what SFDR means for private equity companies. We'll be exploring what private equity firms are expected to report under the SFDR, and how this regulation will change their approach to ESG. To get a lay of the land, we've turned to our colleague Madeline Farman in London. Madeline is a private equity reporter for S&P Global Market Intelligence. Madeline, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Madeline, can you start by talking us through what's required of private equity firms under SFDR?
Sure. So the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation makes it a requirement now for EU headquartered managers as well as private equity funds marketing into the EU, so funds that are approaching investors based within the EU, to provide standardized disclosures on how ESG factors are integrated at certain levels. So let me break that down a bit. As of March 10th, when the regulation came into effect, EU headquartered firms were expected to publish ESG information both at the firm or entity level and at the fund or product level. At the fund or product level, reporting is expected both for new vehicles out in the market as well as older vintage funds. SFDR comes from the EU, but if you operate outside of Europe, that doesn't mean you're exempt. Firms that are actively marketing a fund to European investors will also have to disclose information on that particular fund.
So I'm curious to know what this looks like on the ground. I know you spoke with a private equity manager headquartered in the EU, and can you tell me, how have they approached SFDR requirements?
Sure. So I spoke with Sophie Flack, who is managing partner in charge of ESG at French investment firm Eurazeo. It's also worth noting that Sophie was a member of an EU expert group, which put in place some recommendations on SFDR. With 20 billion euros in assets under management, Eurazeo invests in private equity, private funds, debt, and real assets. It plans to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2040 and is pledged to a role in bridging the widening social gaps, so it has ESG embedded in its strategy. Sophie told me that as a listed entity, Eurazeo has had to report on 150 criteria under non-financial reporting regulations for the past 10 years. So for the firm, it already has the tools, human resources, and the right partnerships outside the firm to deliver on SFDR. So even though it wasn't so complex for the firm, that doesn't mean to say that it was easy.
And I would say the complexity was more to understand this SFDR text, because as a matter of fact, it is a text with sublayers and sublayers of the sublayers and sublayers of the sublayers. So I must say that our life has not been made very easy by the regulators, and we had to work with legal counsels to really understand what had to be done, what had to be done and for when. And as you very well know, the text is still under definitions. So we are still waiting, to know more about it.
By March 10th, the firm had to classify all its funds by the Article 6 to Article 9 framework. Here, she provides some colour on how the firm went about that process. Under the new rules, an Article 6 covers funds which do not integrate sustainability, while Article 8 and 9 take sustainability into account to different extents.
And at Eurazeo, ESG is embedded in all our products for the last 10 years, as I said, at least. The thing is, then it generates a lot of reporting. So we've been extremely pragmatic, and we decided to really focus our efforts for funds which are under deployment and funds which are under fundraising, and 80% of our funds under deployment and fundraising are either Article 8 or Article 9. So we are still waiting to get benchmark from the profession. And the 20% remaining for my financial colleagues who are listening, is for private fund strategy. Private fund strategy, as you know, we invest in other funds. And so we cannot define the classification of a private fund without getting the classification of the underlying funds. So we are waiting for the information from our colleagues. And when we have this information, we will be able to provide a status for the private fund strategy.
One would assume that private equity firms would want to show limited partners that their funds fit within an Article 8 or an Article 9. After all, Article 6 funds are essentially saying that they don't consider ESG as part of their investment process. To get more insight, I spoke to someone who is working closely with private equity firms on SFDR. Andy Pitts-Tucker is Managing Director of Apex ESG Ratings, and he gave some interesting colour around this.
I think there's quite a large category that, for the avoidance of doubt, have categorised themselves as Article 6 at the moment, and then now taking that opportunity to relook at what they have been doing and make sure it is aligned with the legislative needs to be able to categorise themselves as an Article 8. Now, in quite a few cases that we've seen so far, it's not a big leap. It is about rephrasing. It's about making a few points and a very targeted points available on the website and in those pre-disclosure documents. So it's not a big leap for some people. For others, and the majority, I would say it's a significant leap, because ESG is quite new to a lot of people in the private market world. And we tend to get the more proactive coming to us because they recognize us as someone who can help them make those changes. There's a huge number of private equity funds, private debt funds, and other managers out there who haven't taken that step. And they really do need to start thinking about it, because legislation is only going to be ramping up in severity. It is a very important time for them to start thinking about what they need to do.
So, Madeline, what's the next milestone for private equity firms under this legislation?
Andy explained to me that it will be mandatory for EU-headquartered firms with greater than 500 employees to consider any adverse impacts of investment decisions on sustainability factors from June 30th of this year, with the first quantitative reports due by June 30th, 2022. On the fund and product side, Article 8 and 9 funds will have to report, starting from January 2022, on how their ESG characteristics and objectives are being achieved. Andy said Article 8 and Article 9 funds should start gathering data soon in order to explain how the positive ESG characteristics and objectives are being achieved, and thus meet the January 2022 deadline. Article 6 funds will continue to be able to opt out for as long as the underlying funds and products don't consider principal adverse impacts or sustainability risks, unless the firm is EU headquartered and has more than 500 employees. Those firms will no longer be able to opt out as of June 30th, 2021. The caveat to all of this, Andy mentioned to me, is that although the regulatory technical standards that firms are meant to meet in the second phase are in their final draft phase, they're yet to be confirmed. The regulatory technical standards are essentially the quantitative ESG metrics which will be used for this reporting.
Okay, so what are the penalties that firms will face if they don't follow this regulation?
It's interesting. Both Sophie and Andy told me that penalties aren't known at this particular point in time. Apex expects this to be in the hands of individual countries and only to be clarified once Level 2 disclosures come into effect at the earliest. However, both Sophie and Andy argued that the unofficial penalties, if you like, are already in place in the form of reputational damage for non-compliance. Here's what Sophie had to say on this point.
Legal penalties is not so much the question because the entire industry is embedding SFDR. So now all our limited partners have required the information and the bylaws. As a matter of fact, we didn't wait for it. We were proactive and we sent it, in advance of the 10th of March. But it's impossible today to put out a product on the market and not have the bylaws about SFDR classification. And since the industry is requiring it and wouldn't put any money in such an important regulation, I would say you don't need penalties. Penalties are there already. You don't find financing. You don't find funds for products which would not be to the regulation. And of course, when it comes to selling products, so the commercialization phase, who would take the risk? Who would take the risk? Nobody. Because even if you don't know yet the financial penalties for selling products which would not be meeting the requirements, then there is a huge issue of reputation. And in our field of work, in our line of work, reputation is everything.
So the big question for me at this point is, how does the private equity asset class view this regulation? And I ask because this is a really big change for an industry that has relied on self-policing in the past with regards to best practice.
Yes, it's a great question, and I really didn't know what kind of response I would get here. So first, let's go to Andy, who will be able to provide us with a broad brush view of how private equity managers have reacted to this.
How have the private equity funds taken this? Our sense is very, very positive. I think a lot of them view it as a much needed starting point, actually. And I think they recognize the fact that the 10th of March represents a time when this talked about and onerous ESG data collection and reporting noise is now on a pathway to becoming much more standardized and much more processed, which we hope will make their lives as the sort of the data collectors will make their lives much easier, because they will have a sort of a set of rules by which to collect that data and report on it. So this has got to be positive. It's moving ESG in the direction that we want it. And we're not getting anybody come to us saying we're massively concerned about this new additional reporting burden. Some people I have heard say, just maybe we'll see firms not wanting to launch as many Article 8, Article 9 products because of that burden. We're certainly not seeing that. And I would say we're sort of seeing the opposite, because they recognize that actually that's where the flow of money wants to go. So I think this is all being viewed very positively.
Sophie told me that SFDR regulation is complex. It's not yet finalised, and there's still a lot of work to do. But she did say it's a good step for two reasons.
The first reason is finance has an absolutely unique role to play to accelerate the transition towards a low carbon and more inclusive economy. If you look at the billions that are being managed by finance companies, so if those companies embed sustainability, we have a huge lever effect, and we can do it at speed. And we know that the clock is ticking on both topics, both climate and inclusion. The second good thing about this regulation is that this regulation imposes ESG to all financial players. So far, it has very much been, do I want to do this, yes or no? So it was more, companies who find it important do it. Now there is no choice, it needs to be done. And if I am to make a correlation with another topic, when it gets to gender, when it gets to diversity, even if we don't like it, we don't get results if we do not have quotas in place. And 20 years ago, I was not a believer in quotas because I found it sad that we needed quotas to get there. 20 years later, I am now convinced that without quotas, without regulation, we do not drive results. So with this FRDR regulation, with this sustainable finance disclosure regulation, we will drive results on the ESG fronts. And the good news is that we will drive results with one of the most powerful industries to drive change, the finance industry.
In light of this regulation, I did ask Sophie whether private equity as an asset class globally was doing enough on ESG factors and transparency.
So my answer is going to be blunt, and apologies for my colleagues. Definitely, we are not doing enough as an industry. We are still at Eurazeo the sole player to have committed to a decarbonization pathway, which is based on science-based target initiative. Look at our size. We are a significant player, but definitely we are not on the top 3 worldwide. So what is the top 3 doing? Look at the data which are reported. So I would say for the last 3-4 years, you've had some prominent figures of the industry, who have taken public stances on ESG. And this is super important because it is generating focus, attention to the topic, but the execution is lacking. Execution needs to be improved, and we need tomorrow, so maybe it will take 2-3 years to get the right level of quality of data. Customers need to know carbon intensity or the product in which they're investing. So I believe that now the momentum is here. Major leaders of the industry have, committed themselves to the topic, but we need to improve the quality of information. Again, we are not helped because there are no international standards, but there is still a long way to go. And that's where SFDR is generating a big push. So this will drive progress. This will drive transparency, but the road is a bumpy road.
This regulation goes beyond Europe for many reasons, and international regulators are watching and learning. Here's Andy on what this regulation means for private equity globally going forward.
It's a game changer, really. It really does transcend jurisdictional boundaries. Although the EU has been first out with a specific piece of legislation, we are seeing other countries do their thing. I mean, the SEC has now implemented a task force and is looking at what they're going to be doing. I know the UK didn't adopt the EU policy post-Brexit, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be doing its own thing. So what we're certainly going to see is regulators around the globe adopting their own policies, and feel fairly sure that they are not going to be dissimilar in alignment to the SFDR. This is climate, society, the environment. They are global issues. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we're really encouraged by the fact that non-EU investment managers are taking this very seriously, because they recognize it's the right thing to be doing, and they recognize that the flow of money doesn't stop at borders nowadays. It's like everything else. It is global, even if locally there is not legislation to drive that change. There is absolutely fiduciary demand to drive that change. So this is only going to expand from a legislative point of view globally, and we're also going to see the rigor and the disclosure requirements increase as well as time goes on.
This will be an interesting one to watch. This is a sea change for an industry that has self-regulated on the topic of ESG in the past. Not every private equity firm has the resources available to it as Eurazeo does, so this will be a steep learning curve for some.
It'll be interesting to see how the industry adapts to this new regulation and improves on its ESG reporting and tracking down the line.
Yes, and we'll be glad to have you back, Madeline, to hear more about how this regulation is changing the private equity industry.
I'd be happy to.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of ESG Insider, and a special thanks to our producer, Kyle Cangelosi. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and sign up for our weekly newsletter, ESG Insider. See you next time.